Take my bride, let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. Most automakers today sell their cars through franchised dealerships. Contracts exist between them where the factory sells their cars to the franchise dealers, who in turn sell to the public. Outside of buying a Tesla, this is how it's done in the automotive world. You can't buy a Dodge directly from the factory unless you're the government buying some 100,000 of them. And in the car industry, Tesla's business model is causing a stir as other manufacturers also look for ways to eliminate the franchise middleman dealership. But how did this whole system of dealerships come into being? Let's take a look at the history. In the 1880s, when true cars first began to appear, not all makers actually wanted to sell them at first. Carl Benz, for example, completed his Motorwagen in 1885, but made no efforts to go into production and sell them. He was on his third prototype when his wife Bertha made her famous road trip in 1888. This prompted Benz to start advertising his cars in local newspapers, though it would be a few more years and some new models before sales actually took off. Gottlieb Daimler did have production and sales in mind from the beginning, though for him, cars were a sideline to his main business of selling engines. Buying a Daimler car was simple. Order it from the factory and come get it or have it shipped to you once it's ready. This is how Amédée Boully started his commercial steam buses and trucks and had done so since the early 1870s. So for these early car makers, they simply did likewise. By the end of the 1880s, some car makers were offering licenses to other manufacturers. These licenses allowed other companies to make their cars, in whole or part. This was often much easier than shipping individual cars internationally, and in those countries where there was a significant market for cars, selling the rights to make their cars to a more local company was a win-win for all involved. The maker would be paid well for the license, and the local builder also profits from their own sales. It was in the late 1890s that the first dealerships came into being, and how they came into being depends on which side of the Atlantic you're on. Let's look at Europe first. Late 19th century Europe was covered with roads suitable for automobile use, and so the industry had much opportunity to grow. France was particularly prolific in both the amount of cars built and number of companies doing it. The first major car races were held there as well, so it should come as no surprise that the first true car dealerships were also born there. It was primarily, though not always, the European elite that started dealerships. The Paris World Exhibition of 1889 sparked significant interest in the infant auto industry, and wealthy folks started buying personal cars from Benz, Daimler, Peugeot, and Édion Bouton. More manufacturers sprang up in France over the following decade, and the demand for cars swelled. However, transporting individual cars was still expensive. It was far more economical to ship many at once by train, ship, or barge, and some of these rich European nobles started buying cars in bulk. Let's look at Émile Jelinek as an example. He had been driving various French cars with dissatisfaction until he discovered Daimler in 1896. He bought a couple of them and tried them out as they met with some approval. Within 2 years, he established his own showroom in Nice and was buying Daimlers 10 at a time and having them shipped to his facility, where he would sell them at a profit. This is essentially how a dealership works today. It was from businesses like Jelinek's that the first dealer license agreements developed. The first of such licenses was issued by Panhard and Levasseur in 1893. What P&L did was divide France and the rest of Europe into territories. When a businessman wants to open a dealership to sell their cars, they'd make sure that there were no existing dealerships in the territory. If there were, he'd have to open shop elsewhere on the map. So these early licenses were primarily to give a dealer exclusivity within a particular region. They did not prevent the manufacturer from selling directly to the consumer from the factory door. Many of these first dealerships would offer several different makes of brand new cars under the same roof. Additionally, many makers would give a dealership exclusive rights to sell in a specific country. England was particularly often a recipient of such agreements, which are the precursors to modern dealership license contracts. In these, the British dealer had exclusive rights for sales in the country. The maker would only ship cars to the dealer. An Englishman could not order a car from Panhard and Levasseur. He'd have to go through the London dealer. Charles Giraud was a prominent example of such a British car dealer at the time. Now in the USA, the lack of roads and motoring events got cars off to a slow start. But by the late 1890s, America's auto industry was starting to take shape. Detroit was a particular hotspot, so it should come as no surprise that the first car dealership in America was established there in 1897 by William Metzger. Initially selling electric cars, the showroom would eventually offer gas and steam cars as well. Indeed, it was from this showroom that the very first American dealership license agreement was made between Metzger and Oldsmobile. The first exclusive dealership was established in 1899 by the Winton Motor Company, selling cars to the showroom of Mr. H. Kohler in Reading, Pennsylvania. Winton also made the first car hauling trucks the same year to help supply this dealership with fresh from the factory cars. Although this is quite common today, this was the first privately owned dealership anywhere in the world that was under contract to only sell one make of cars. Now, the importance of the Studebaker Company in American new car dealership history cannot be underestimated. By the turn of the 20th century, Studebaker was the largest manufacturer of vehicles in the U.S. and had been for decades. True, these were horse-drawn, wagons, carriages, coaches, and the like, but nonetheless, the company fielded hundreds of showrooms all across North America. Some were company-owned, others privately owned, but if you wanted to buy a Studebaker, you had to go through a dealership. You couldn't buy direct from the factory. This business model of Studebakers caught the eye of both Billy Durant and Henry Ford. Both Ford and General Motors were very cash-poor during the first decade of the 20th century. They lacked the capital to build a company-owned network of dealerships like Studebaker did. However, if they sold dealership rights just like Panhard did, such a network could be established using someone else's money. This would be the beginning of the true franchise model of dealerships. The car maker was responsible to not sell to the general public, but to only sell to their dealership partners. The manufacturer provided cars, trucks, and exclusivity of territory to each of its dealers. Also, the manufacturer would do general advertising about their cars and direct interested customers to their local dealer. In return, the dealership would pay for the showroom facility, the cars, and the costs involved getting the cars to them. The first dealership of this kind was opened by William Hewson, who sold Ford cars from his San Francisco showroom from late 1903. This arrangement was successful for all involved. Ford finally made a profit, and Hewson made back good money for his investment. By 1908, when the Model T debuted, Ford already had several dozen privately owned Ford franchise dealerships in key cities across America, and GM was close behind. This franchise model of car dealerships spread across America and the world, and has been the primary way to buy a new car for the last 100 years. This is why Tesla is causing such a stir in the automotive world. They sell online factory direct. And under the various franchise laws in the USA and elsewhere, the older car makers that are bound by their dealership network agreements cannot legally do that. Many manufacturers are beginning to resent this, that they are bound to a century-old marketing system that is obviously obsolete and are looking for ways to change their business model. Meanwhile, the dealerships have invested heavily into their respective manufacturer's business and won't silently see their livelihood disappear. This tension between the two will take some time to resolve. Hopefully, less time than it took to create the issue. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.